Glad to see you on my channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.
Nobody heard it coming. No emergency broadcast interrupted your evening. No president stood at a podium and told you that the rules of the global economy had just been quietly rewritten. No anchor broke into scheduled programming with a red banner and a grave expression. The world simply woke up one morning and found that the machinery it had always assumed would keep running. The ships, the ports, the endless flow of goods across the Pacific had developed a strange, unexplained hesitation. Containers weren't arriving on schedule. Licenses weren't being renewed at the usual pace. The bureaucratic rhythm that had quietly underpinned decades of American prosperity was skipping beats. And the most disturbing thing about all of it was not what Beijing said, it was what Beijing didn't say. No ultimatums, no formal declarations, no dramatic announcements of embargo or retaliation, just silence. Careful, calculated, surgically precise silence. And that silence, it turned out, was the most powerful economic weapon anyone had deployed in a generation. Here is what makes this moment so different from every trade dispute you have watched play out on the news before. Every previous confrontation followed a recognizable script. One side announced tariffs. The other side retaliated with tariffs of its own. There were press conferences, communiques, dramatic headlines, emergency phone calls between heads of state. The conflict was visible. It had a face and a voice. You could track it, analyze it, respond to it. What is happening right now has no face. It has no voice. It operates entirely in the space between official statements, in the gap between what governments say publicly and what the cargo manifests, bond auction results, and currency markets are quietly revealing to anyone paying close enough attention. China has not declared a blockade. It has not announced an embargo on rare earth exports. It has simply allowed certain administrative processes to slow down. Licenses that used to be renewed in days now take weeks. Shipping documentation that moved smoothly through bureaucratic channels is encountering friction that nobody can formally complain about because nobody has formally created it. And in a global economy built on the principle of just-in-time delivery, where factories carry days of inventory rather than months, where production lines stop the moment a single critical component fails to arrive. This kind of invisible friction is not a minor inconvenience. It is a tourniquet on the circulatory system of American industry. The numbers that have begun to emerge from behind the official reassurances are the kind that keep economists awake at night. Freight volumes at the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, the two great arterial channels through which the American consumer economy breathes, have contracted at rates not recorded since the pandemic lockdowns of 2020. The manufacturing sector's activity index has slipped into contraction territory. Major corporations have begun freezing capital expenditure decisions, citing supply chain uncertainty. The dollar index has drifted below thresholds that traders have been watching with quiet unease. Yields on 30-year Treasury bonds have moved in a direction that signals something has shifted in the relationship between the United States government and the global investors who have historically been willing to fund its deficit without asking too many questions. Foreign holdings of American debt, driven in significant part by Japan and China, the two largest external creditors, have declined by tens of billions of dollars over a period of months. This is not panic in words. Words are cheap. This is panic in capital flows, And capital flows do not lie to protect a political narrative. Do you believe China is deliberately using this silence as a strategic weapon, or do you think this is temporary friction that will resolve itself? Write your answer in the comments right now. I want to know what you think. To understand why what is unfolding right now is genuinely without precedent, you need to absorb one fact that most people have never been asked to take seriously. China does not merely hold a significant share of the global rare earth materials market. It holds what amounts to a functional monopoly over the refining and processing of those materials. And that distinction is everything. It means that even when a rare earth mineral is physically extracted from the ground in Australia, Brazil, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, it will, in all probability, pass through a Chinese refining facility before it reaches its final application. Without these processed materials, lithium, cobalt, neodymium, dysprosium, and a carefully maintained list of others, the modern world does not function in the way you experience it. The battery in your electric vehicle does not exist. The semiconductor powering your phone does not exist in its current form. The guidance system in a precision-guided munition does not achieve its accuracy. The radar in a next-generation fighter aircraft does not reach its performance specifications. Tesla, Apple, Intel, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, each of them, in ways that vary in degree, but not in fundamental character, depends on supply chains whose most critical segments run through Chinese ports, Chinese processing plants, and Chinese logistics networks. When Beijing slows the issuance of export licenses, not bans, not embargoes, just slows, those supply chains begin to develop fracture lines, quietly, without announcement, but with consequences that compound with every passing week. Rare earth export volumes to the United States declined by nearly a fifth within weeks of the friction beginning. No decree announced this. No official policy paper authorized it. Administrative procedures simply began moving at a different pace. This is what strategic patience looks like when it is practiced at the highest level. There is no dramatic headline to counter with a press conference. There is no specific action to retaliate against with a new round of tariffs. There is only a gradually tightening constraint and the dawning recognition in Washington that the trade war framework that served as the foundation of the administration's economic strategy was built on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The assumption was that China needed access to the American market more than America needed Chinese supply chains. That assumption made sense when it was formulated. It no longer reflects the world as it actually exists in 2026, and while the administration has been slow to acknowledge this publicly, the markets figured it out almost immediately. The quiet extension of tariff exemptions on Chinese smartphones, semiconductors, and medical equipment, announced without fanfare and carefully framed as a routine procedural matter, was in reality something far more significant. It was the first visible crack in the wall of official confidence. It was Washington acknowledging, in the only language governments use, when they cannot admit a mistake directly, that the leverage was not distributed the way the strategy had assumed, that the pain of full decoupling was not symmetrical, that the American economy was not, in fact, insulated from the consequences of confrontation with the world's largest manufacturer and the dominant processor of the materials on which modern industry depends. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Consider what 30 years of Chinese industrial policy actually built, not the political speeches about it, not the Western commentary analyzing it, the physical reality of it. China spent 3 decades connecting ports, railways, industrial clusters, energy infrastructure, and financial centers into a single integrated ecosystem of production. Second-tier suppliers built their operations adjacent to first-tier suppliers. Third-tier component manufacturers clustered around those. Specialized chemical producers located their plants within logistics distance of the factories they served. The result is not simply a collection of factories, it is an organism, a living, self-reinforcing network of production capacity and logistical capability that cannot be replicated by announcement, cannot be conjured by subsidy, cannot be rebuilt in 5 years or even 10. American corporations understood this perfectly well, which is precisely why they embedded themselves so deeply in it. The efficiency gains were real. The cost advantages were real. The returns to shareholders were real. What nobody wanted to price in, what the entire system was structured to avoid pricing in, was the strategic risk that came packaged with every efficiency gain. The risk that the network's owner might one day choose to operate it selectively. That day has arrived, and the response from Washington has revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, just how far the gap has grown between the rhetoric of American industrial strength and the reality of American industrial dependency. The reshoring initiatives are real. The semiconductor subsidies are real. The political will to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity is, at least in its stated form, genuine. But political will does not build a rare earth processing facility. Political will does not train the specialized workforce that advanced manufacturing requires. Political will does not compress the decade-long process of developing a supplier ecosystem into a budget cycle. Vietnam can absorb some assembly, India can absorb some, Mexico can absorb some. But the second and third tier supply networks, the ones that actually determine whether a production line runs or stops, those took China 30 years to assemble. The alternatives don't exist at the required scale. Not today, possibly not for years. And the markets have already done the math on what that means for corporate earnings, for inflation, and for the cost of borrowing. Because here is the part that affects you directly. The part that makes this story not just geopolitically interesting, but personally relevant to anyone watching this video, regardless of where they live. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are paid by domestic importers who pass the cost to domestic consumers. When import costs rise, retail prices rise. Coffee, electronics, appliances, automobiles, construction materials. The cascade is mechanical and inevitable. And on top of the tariff-driven price increases already working their way through the system, the supply chain disruptions add a second layer of inflationary pressure, because when supply tightens and demand remains constant, prices rise regardless of what any policy document says. The Institute for Supply Management's index of new manufacturing orders has fallen to levels that have historically preceded recession. Consumer sentiment surveys are reflecting the kind of anxiety that does not reverse quickly once it takes hold. The American consumer, who voted for lower prices and economic stability, is living through an inflation dynamic that was not caused by an external shock or a pandemic. It was caused by a series of deliberate political decisions, and the bill is arriving at the checkout line. Meanwhile, China is doing something that deserves far more attention than it is receiving. It is not retaliating loudly. It is not matching tariff with tariff in the way that every Western economic playbook predicted it would. Instead, it is quietly redirecting flows. Exports to Latin America are growing at double-digit rates. Shipments to the Middle East are expanding. Goods that previously moved directly into American ports are finding their way to those markets through third countries, through logistical arrangements that are formally compliant with every applicable rule and factually represent a comprehensive restructuring of global trade geography. This is not improvisation. This is a strategy that was designed to be executed precisely in this scenario, one in which American tariff pressure provided the political justification for a reorientation that Beijing had long considered strategically desirable. The trade war that was supposed to pressure China into submission has instead provided the catalyst for China to accelerate a diversification away from American market dependency that it had been pursuing incrementally for years. And the financial dimension of this realignment is where the consequences become most difficult to reverse. Central banks across the developing world have been quietly increasing their gold reserves. Saudi Arabia is actively exploring alternatives to the dollar for oil contract settlements, a development that would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago. Brazil has expanded the share of its trade with China settled in domestic currencies. India is conducting an increasing volume of cross-border transactions outside dollar-denominated channels. None of these individual moves constitutes an abandonment of the dollar, but taken together and placed in the context of declining foreign demand for American Treasury securities, they describe a trajectory. The dollar's role in global trade is not collapsing. It is gradually becoming less exclusive. And in global finance, exclusivity is the primary source of structural power. Once that exclusivity begins to erode, the process has a momentum of its own. Some analysts have begun reaching for historical analogies, and the most apt one is uncomfortable for Washington. The transition from British sterling to the American dollar as the world's reserve currency did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened across decades, through the debt of 2 world wars, through the gradual reorientation of trade flows, through the quiet decisions of central banks around the world to hold more dollars and fewer pounds. The pound did not disappear. It simply became less essential. The moment when a currency transitions from indispensable to merely important is the moment when its structural power begins to decay. Today, for the first time since the Bretton Woods Agreement established the architecture of the post-war financial order, serious people in serious institutions are asking out loud whether the dollar's role as the singular anchor of global finance is permanent, or whether it is a historical arrangement that can be unmade by the same forces that made it. Do you think we are witnessing the beginning of the end of dollar dominance, or is this a temporary turbulence that the American system will absorb and overcome? Tell me what you think in the comments. What makes the current moment uniquely dangerous is the combination of external pressure and internal fragmentation. Foreign challenges to American financial primacy have existed before and been absorbed. What has not been tested in the modern era is a simultaneous assault from the outside and a dysfunction from within. American political polarization has reached a point at which long-term industrial strategy, the kind that requires bipartisan consensus sustained across multiple election cycles, is nearly impossible to execute. Every infrastructure bill, every semiconductor subsidy package, every attempt to build the institutional foundations of a post-dependency industrial base gets pulled into the gravitational field of partisan conflict. Business leaders who understand the structural challenge clearly are reluctant to commit capital to multi-decade projects in an environment where the regulatory and policy landscape can shift dramatically between administrations. The investments required to rebuild rare earth processing capacity, to establish domestic battery supply chains, to create the supplier ecosystems that advanced manufacturing requires. These are not decisions that companies make in an environment of maximum uncertainty, and maximum uncertainty is precisely what the current political environment delivers. Trump's political genius, if it can be called that, lies in his ability to direct public attention toward the performance of conflict rather than its consequences. The tariff announcements, the confrontational rhetoric, the declarations of victory that arrive before the outcomes are known. These serve a domestic political function entirely separate from their economic effects. They signal strength to a base that wants to see strength performed. They generate the kind of news cycle that crowds out more granular, more consequential stories about supply chain contraction and bond market signals and the quiet decisions being made in central banks from Riyadh to Jakarta. While the cameras follow the performance, the actual redistribution of economic power proceeds without interruption. The ports are quieter than they should be. The cargo that used to flow in one direction is flowing in others. The investors who used to treat American government debt as the closest thing to a risk-free asset that exists are running more sophisticated models about what risk-free means in 2026. And the administration's response to all of this has been to announce loudly and repeatedly that everything is fine. The allies of the United States are watching this with an attention that is not quite alarm, but is definitely not reassurance. Europe is navigating with increasing sophistication the tension between its strategic partnership with Washington and its economic exposure to Beijing. And the navigation increasingly looks like a deliberate hedge rather than a committed alliance posture. Asian economies are deepening regional financial integration at a pace that would have seemed ambitious 5 years ago. Gulf states are conducting what amounts to a strategic diversification of their political and economic partnerships, using their energy leverage to create options that did not previously exist. This is not the world of rigid Cold War blocs. This is a world of fluid alignments and pragmatic calculations, where the decisive question for every medium-sized economy is not which superpower to back, but how to maintain maximum flexibility across both. In that world, the premium on American reliability, which was always the core of American soft power, is being discounted in real time. Consider what happens if the current pause extends for another 6 months at its present intensity. American corporations that have been operating on the assumption that supply chain disruptions are temporary and that normalization is around the corner will begin making permanent strategic decisions based on the new reality. Factories will be redesigned around different material inputs where that is possible. Production processes will be modified. Sourcing relationships will be rebuilt with suppliers in other geographies at considerable cost and with significant compromise in efficiency. Once those decisions are made and the capital is committed, the previous supply chain architecture does not simply reassemble itself when political conditions improve. The rewiring of industrial infrastructure is not easily reversed. This is why the current moment carries a quality of potential irreversibility that distinguishes it from previous episodes of US-China trade friction. It is not just the immediate economic impact that matters. It is the permanent restructuring decisions that are being triggered by that impact, decisions that will shape the geography of global production for the next generation. China's leadership understands this dynamic with a clarity that is not always matched on the other side of the Pacific. The strategy being executed is not designed to deliver a quick knockout. It is designed to impose cumulative, compounding pressure at a level that causes irreversible structural changes in the American industrial and financial landscape, while remaining calibrated carefully enough to avoid triggering the kind of emergency consolidation response that a more dramatic confrontation might produce. Too much pressure too quickly, and Washington finds the political will and the congressional consensus to mount a genuine strategic response. The right amount of pressure, sustained patiently over time, and the changes accumulate below the threshold of political crisis, while remaining fully visible in the economic data. It is the strategy of a player who is comfortable with the long game, and the long game is precisely what the American political system, with its two-year election cycles and its structural bias toward short-term performance, is least equipped to play. What comes next is genuinely uncertain, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. There is a scenario in which market pressure and corporate lobbying force a negotiated de-escalation, in which the financial industry, the technology sector, and the manufacturing lobby collectively communicate to the White House that the costs of continued confrontation have exceeded what the political gains can justify. There is a scenario in which the confrontation deepens and the global economy fragments further into parallel systems with different currencies, different technology standards, and different regulatory architectures. There is a scenario in which some combination of domestic political crisis and international mediation produces a new framework agreement that stabilizes the relationship without resolving its underlying tensions. Each of these paths carries different implications for your investments, for the purchasing power of your savings, for the cost of borrowing, for the price of the goods that appear on your shopping receipt. What is not uncertain is this: the architecture of the global economy that most people alive today grew up taking for granted, the architecture in which a single dominant currency served as the universal medium of exchange, in which a single dominant market served as the engine of global demand, in which a single dominant country set the rules that everyone else followed. That architecture has developed structural fractures that cannot be plastered over with press conferences and tariff announcements. The cracks were forming before the current administration took office. The current confrontation has accelerated their development to a point where they are visible to anyone willing to look at the data rather than the rhetoric. The question is no longer whether the system is changing. The question is how fast, in which direction, and who position themselves to navigate the transition rather than be caught flat-footed by it. This is not a story about two governments arguing over trade policy. It is a story about the slow, unglamorous, entirely real redistribution of economic power in the 21st century. It is a story told not in speeches and summits, but in cargo manifests and bond yields and the quiet decisions of central bankers who do not hold press conferences. It is happening right now, at this moment, while your attention is being directed elsewhere. Understanding what is actually occurring, not the performance, but the mechanism, is the difference between seeing the world as it is and seeing the world as various powerful institutions need you to believe it is. That difference has always mattered. In the period we are entering, it will matter more than ever. Stay with us for the next part of this story, because what is being decided right now in the rooms that have no cameras will determine the financial reality that you and everyone around you will be living in for the next decade.